The title of this multimedia research brief is Disproportionality in Special Education. Each of the following slides will encompass information and a summarization from 5 different articles addressing this issue. Each slide also has audio, which will further describe the information presented on the slides. The topic being addressed and discussed in this research brief is that of disproportionality in special education. I will be exploring the what and why of this subject in reference to public schools nationwide. English language learners and African American students will be addressed more in depth and specifically. I grew up and went to school in a town with very little diversity. Before attending college, I had very little background about issues such as disproportionality. This subject was brought up often in some of my college courses and was completely new to me. I decided to research this topic in order to learn more about why disproportionality happens and how schools and students are affected. In the beginning of my research, one of the main things that I wanted to learn about was, in general, what is disproportionality. Each of these issues will be addressed throughout the PowerPoint and through the audio presentation. The first article, titled Disproportionality in Special Education, Identification and the Placement of English Language Learners, addressed how often English language learners are placed in special education. The opening quote to the article was an astonishing piece of data. The author, Amanda Sullivan, states that students identified as culturally and linguistically diverse represent an ever-increasing percentage of the U.S. population, with English language learners comprising the fastest-growing subgroup. This information opened up a broad subject that was addressed through the rest of the article. Sullivan discusses that English language learners have a very difficult time in the education system because of the lack of supports that they receive. Lack of supports usually lead to one of two things: increasing retention and dropout rates, or placement in special education. English language learning students have the highest grade retention and dropout rate. One outstanding piece of data that disproportionality does not only occur within the special education classroom, but in special education identification, placement decisions, disciplinary consequences, academic performance, and exiting from special education services. Though disproportionality is often referred to when speaking about special education services, the article stresses that disproportionality occurs elsewhere as well. Diverse students, especially students of the minority, need to be given supports in all areas of education in order to avoid overrepresentation in schools. The most shocking piece of information that I discovered after reading this article was that the federal special education law now requires states to monitor and address racial disproportionality, but the policy does not address English language learners. I personally do not understand why racial aspects are addressed, but language is not. Both of these characteristics often go hand in hand. By not having this policy address English language learners, schools are failing at identification. Providing supports is one of the main ideas addressed in this article. If supports are not given, the students may not have the opportunity to display their knowledge. Different assessments need to be given to these students in order for the results to be accurate. The author hopes that by continuing to review this data and information, this will help to improve the issue of disproportionality and overrepresentation. This article, titled Justifying and Explaining Disproportionality, 1968 to 2008, A Critique of Underlying Views of Culture, takes a somewhat different approach to the issue of disproportionality than the article discussed previously. This article looks at how special education and overrepresentation has improved over time. When looking at these issues over such a large span of time, improvements will have been made. Special education has improved, and overrepresentation is finally becoming addressed. Overrepresentation was an issue that was not discussed in 1968. It was during the years in between 1968 and 2008 that improvements began to be made. The author of this article agrees that advances in research, policy, and practice have been made but there is much more to do. In one case that the authors studied very closely throughout their research was one of a student of a minority racial background that was identified as colorblind. This student was not given the extra supports that were needed in order to resolve the problem. Accommodations were not given, and the student began to fail in certain areas of his education. His assessments did not take this quote-unquote deficit into account, rather it was ignored. This is a direct impact that disproportionality has on minority students in education. This particular student was tested and evaluated to receive special education services solely due to the fact that he could not answer questions that were impacted and affected by the issues around color and color identification. Though these issues are being addressed and improvements have been made, more steps need to be taken so that instances such like this one do not occur in the education system any longer. In the article titled A Qualitative Analysis of Teachers and Counselors' Perceptions of the Overrepresentation of African Americans in Special Education, a Preliminary Approach, the author Rebecca Curtis and the others took a more specific approach at looking at one culture and its place in overrepresentation. The authors of this research article looked at and observed several schools in the state of Alabama. The authors stated that they began this research because they felt that there was an overabundance of African American students being tested to receive special education services. The students were actually being diagnosed under the IDEA requirements as mentally retarded. There was no found supports given to the students prior to the testing for special education. The authors discovered that there seemed to be a subconscious bias that the teachers had placed on these students. The fact that this school was in the South and that the majority of the teachers in the school were white seemed to create a barrier. The fourth article that has been reviewed and analyzed for this research brief looks at overrepresentation and disproportionality in a multi-layer perspective. The title of this article is English Language Learners, Learning Disabilities, and Overrepresentation, a Multiple-Level Analysis. The authors, Rueda and Windmuller, found that there is a connection between English language learners and diagnoses of learning disabilities. The authors observed and evaluated several English language learners. These students were diagnosed with learning disabilities under the definition provided by the IDEA. The authors came to the conclusion that supports and differentiation were not given to the students in a positive manner that would allow them to display their knowledge. The students were assessed in the same way that regular education students were. There were no provided language supports. The authors acknowledged the fact that overrepresentation takes place because students are not given any extra supports when they are needed. The students that these authors observed were quote-unquote bright when given the help and encouragement that they needed. A common trend has been occurring through all of the articles that have been reviewed. Supports have not been given. Since the previous article addressed learning disabilities in correlation to English language learners, I thought that it would be interesting to look specifically at another disability and how it is connected to overrepresentation as well. The disability discussed in this article, titled Universal Screening for Behavioral and Emotional Risk, a Promising Method for Reducing Disproportionate Placement in Special Education, was behavioral and emotional disorders. This article does not so much address minorities in special education as it does the specific disability. The article states that more often than ever, students are being diagnosed as having emotional or behavior disorders. These students are placed in special education and hardly receive supports before or during the process. These students are often seen as a risk to others and are not given much of a chance to work in the general education classroom. Once again, the idea of lack of supports appears. A bias is brought onto these students. Teachers often give less accommodations to these students because they do not want to think that educational needs and changes should be made for these students. The authors observed that general education teachers did not want to seem did not want to have these students in their classroom and were apprehensive when told that they would need to teach these students. The main problem with behavioral and emotional disorders is that many teachers do not make accommodations when they are being tested for whether or not they should receive special education services. It is obvious, though, through the research that the authors discussed in this article, these students do need extra help and more often than not do not receive it and end up in the special education setting. Many similarities remain very obvious throughout the 5 research articles that I chose to review for this project. The main and most obvious connection between the 5 of the articles was that supports were not given to the students that were being tested for special education. Overrepresentation is a problem that has been going on for years in special education. The students need to be given extra support and accommodations need to be made for students so that they can display the knowledge that they have in ways that work best for them. Another thing that was addressed between the articles was the different connections between disabilities and cultures and ethnicities. Many of the students that were being tested for special education services were of a minority culture or ethnicity. In my opinion, this seems to be occurring because there's a bias that teachers may subconsciously hold against some of these students. Even though the teachers may subconsciously be doing so, it seems that teachers place a bias on students based on their home life, culture, ethnicity, past family members, or where they are from. In order to stop overrepresentation, teachers need to concentrate solely on the needs of the students and ignore other outside factors. The differences between these articles were a lot less obvious. There wasn't as many differences between the articles. The main differences was that different ethnicities were addressed. One article specifically addressed African Americans, while others specifically addressed English language learners. Though the articles on English language learners did not explicitly say what language or which ethnicity the students were from. Another change and difference between the articles was the outlook that these articles and authors held on the subject. 4 out of the 5 articles felt that overrepresentation is still a very big issue. While the other article felt that this was a big issue, the authors also felt that improvements have been made and that improvements are continuing to be made. In my own personal opinion, the idea of overrepresentation is an idea that all future educators need to become knowledgeable about. Especially in classrooms today, there will be students of very diverse backgrounds and have very different, diverse ways of learning. Teachers need to keep in mind that giving them different types of assessments and allowing them to display their knowledge in ways that benefit them will improve scores and reduce the idea of overrepresentation and disproportionality in schools. By allowing teachers to address the specific needs of each individual student, students will become more confident in the classroom and will also be given a better chance at remaining in the general education setting.